bunch of liberals, I'm sure, because they're always a good audience. And sometimes they're very noisy audience too. But so we have this opportunity with a guy who, in his business career, learned a long time ago that this is what I have figured out for myself, that he does one thing at a time. He wanted to do the healthcare thing, and that was done. He had the votes. I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing. However, there was one guy who happens to sit next to me on the floor of the Senate who voted no, and that was unexpected. So that loss by one vote, that will be coming around, I can assure you. Then he got into the tough area, a lot tougher than infrastructure, and that is on the tax revisions. And that was a very difficult, a heavy lift, but he was able to get that through and get it done. So the next thing that he was delayed a little bit by all this border stuff that's going on, but he is now with both feet in this thing to the infrastructure. So I say that to just, my impression is he decides what he's going to do, and then he goes ahead and does it, unlike a lot of people in politics. So we had a meeting yesterday. You were going to ask about that, I'm sure.
Oh yes, I am. You guys all met at the White House. And oftentimes we don't really get to know what happened and what the conversations were about because the cameras only are occasionally allowed in. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, you know the basic ingredients because he's been talking about, you used that in your introduction. He's talking about, yes, the hard stuff is up front, 200 billion. He has that broken down, 200 billion, 100 billion of that is going to be used for stimulus with the various local and state agencies and individuals, so that those states that participate in it to a greater extent will be rewarded with more participation to encourage them to do what they should be doing anyway. Now, I've been around for a long time. In fact, I've been on every one of these transportation authorizations since 1987, and I was in the House at that time. And so we learned that this is something that, frankly, I'm pretty good at this. I don't do very many things well. I often say the only two things that I do is ride horses and fly airplanes, and everything else is like, I've got a lot of superiors in other areas. But when we look and see those years that I chaired the Environment Public Works Committee, some of you know that, and some of you were participating in that. My counterpart was Barbara Boxer. Now, if you name all during the last 20 years, the three most liberal members of the United States Senate, Barbara Boxer would be among them. If you name the most conservative members, I would be among them. So how can we get along and get things done? Well, we could, because this is the one area you can do it. This is an area that everyone is for. In fact, without naming names, because I think you know who I'm talking about anyway, when we had a few years ago, a lot of Republicans running for President of the United States, and they're all trying to be more conservative than the other one, and consequently, when they go back to their states, and people would jump on them and say, "Well, wait a minute, you're not supporting the transportation." Their response is always, "Oh, I wasn't talking about transportation." So they always draw that out, because that's the one thing that everybody wants. Everybody wants roads and highways. You have allies. You know, I get very upset with some of the Republicans that I serve with who are trying to establish conservative credentials. And they start to get on the Senate floor and they talk about, well, we can't do this. I remember in MAP 21, they said the same thing. We can't spend all that money and all that. But that's what we're supposed to be doing. You know, there's an old document nobody reads anymore. It's called the Constitution. It says we're supposed to be doing two things. First of all, defending America, and then they called them post roads at that time, the roads and highways. So we all got together. The group that met yesterday with the president was the chairman of the chairman of the committees. I had the chair of the transportation committee. So this is in the House, in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans. And there was really a lot of agreement. You normally don't get a group like that together and have them agree. Well, what did the president, of course, had the 200 billion. He has this broken down. 50 billion is going to be rural, and just kind of broad outlines of it. Then he recognizes there's going to have to be a source of funding. We talked about that, and there's a lot of discussion. Of course, my good friend, Democrat, who is, I'll mention his name, talking about, he was just rejoicing because he's been wanting to increase tax, any kind of tax his whole career. And so he was rejoicing, thinking that we all get together, we're going to increase the highway tax. Well, this, it may happen, it may not happen. It's not happening when he wants it to happen. But there are so many other ways, funding ways. For example, you're familiar with lithium. Lithium was put together so that we would actually use it for drinking and wastewater. But he wants to expand that so it'll include ports. Now, you guys probably are not aware that we are in Oklahoma the most inland warm water port. We're a port. We're navigable in Oklahoma. Did you know that? No, not many people do know it, but we are. And so we have serious problems, and that's all a part of this. It's not just roads and highways. The ports are very, very important, an important part. So what he wants to do is to be able to get some of the inland waterways along with deep water ports. I was not as interested in that, but we had a discussion on the ports. So we would be using some of the lithium money that was not eligible before. Then we have something, and this is where I'll lose you, and this is where I lost some of at least the Democrats around the table yesterday morning. And that is, and this was this is an idea. It really started with Democrats. It was President John Kennedy, was back in 1962. He said, we need more money for the Great Society programs. He said the best way to increase government revenues is to reduce marginal rates. And he reduced marginal rates, and 4 years later, the amount of revenue that came in increased by 30%. Now, I know you're thinking, well, this isn't going to be any way to do it. It is. Look what happened in 1981. In 1981, the total amount of money that was there to run government was $469 billion. And that's when Ronald Reagan took the rate down from 90% to 70%, and then all the other rates went down accordingly. And that $469 billion changed 2 years later to $720 billion. I mean, that is the reason that it increased, the revenue increase. Now, what's happened so far? This president's been in office for a year. And if you go back and wind the clock back a year, and then look at the 8 years prior to that, Barack Obama, and I say this, I like the guy and all that, I disagree with everything he did. But his idea at that time was to concentrate in areas, the social areas. In fact, I thought I'll be talking to this group about the defense this afternoon. And I'm always reminded that during his 8 years, he had a policy. You can't put in more money into our defense system, let's put an equal amount of money into social programs. Well, that's not what the Constitution says to do. And of course, that's not what this president is going to do. So we're correcting these deficiencies. But if you look at it and just look at it as to what history has shown us, the average in the 8 years that Obama was president of the United States, the average increase in economic activity, GDP, was 1.5% for 8 years. Now, what has it been since this guy's been in office? It's exceeded 3%. It's now anticipated, the Wall Street Journal said 4.5%. It's going to go up. Now, for each increase of 1%, that equates to $2.9 trillion over a 10-year period. So just look at that. This has happened before. It's going to happen again. And that's going to be the main thing. But they're going to be searching for different opportunities for funding. But that's going to be the major increase. And again, it's not a sellable thing. People can't get their arms around it. But every time in history that's been done, we've had those results. I forgot what your question was.
It was just about flipping the formula of private versus public funding. And yesterday, I think the day before on the Senate floor, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is already kind of laying down his marker on this formula with a giant poster board that said Trump tolls, because in the view of the Democrats, any formula that requires a lot of public funding is going to necessarily require some kind of gas tax or toll. And I wonder if you could talk about whether you think that should be, I mean, part of the infrastructure plan was to loosen the toll regulations so that maybe the interstates could have tolls. What do you think about that idea, and should that be part of the
That was
funding?
part of the discussion yesterday about all the options that are out there for funding. And tolls, obviously are in the mix, and we talked about that. Now, there is a basic philosophical difference on the floor of the United States Senate, the same with the House, or the mayor of the Senate, and that is Democrats don't believe anything's going to happen unless it comes direct from public funding. They want the money. They want it, all of them say this, but I don't know an exception on the floor. Now, there are some exceptions. There are 9 endangered species in the Democrat line, the ones who are up for re-election. They're in cycle this year, and so they're acting like Republicans. But in terms of what they do and what they believe it's got to be money coming from the federal government, and that's all they talk about. That can come in the form of just direct. They don't even like tolls as well as they like just the direct money. So it'd be a reprioritize. Some of that will happen, but again, we talked in this meeting yesterday morning about any number of ways in participating in the incentives that can be there for the private sector to come in. But tolling is on the table, and it's one that is going to be considered as one of the options.
And another.
Now, we can get into a lot of details on this. I want to recognize that this is the toughest of the questions. But we talked about what is it going to look like. Now, when you talk about tolls, there are some things we can't use tolls on. On the inland waterway, you can't use tolls because that is something that there's no alternative. You can only use tolls when there's an alternative. There's no alternative there. So they don't work across the board, but that will be, certainly it's on the table, it will be a consideration.
Interestingly, there were reports yesterday about the president endorsing the gas tax, and I'll tell you on Capitol Hill from talking to a lot of lawmakers over the years, what I sense now is that there's more, people are warming up to the gas tax. A few years ago, you couldn't really get many Republicans behind the idea, but I hear a lot of Republicans saying, look, we need to at least consider that. Is momentum building for the so-called user fee, and what did the president say about that?
I know the comments that were made after that meeting, and I know who made them, and there was, I have to say, a lot of wishful thinking in those comments, because the individual who was leading that thought is one that's always talked about for as long as I can remember. And there's a lot of truth to that. I was around. In fact, we know what one of the biggest problems was back in the 80s and 90s. There was too much money in the highway trust money. And so, you remember, when Bill Clinton came in, he took $12 billion out of that, and it took me 3 years to get the $12 billion back into the highway trust fund. But then we saw what happened. We had concentration on cars that are, driving on that don't use gas. And by the way, that was discussed too, and I discussed that.
Right.
Because why should they have a free ride? Besides that, this is America. In America, we have choices that we can make, and the market is dictating those choices. And we want the market to know that in America, we're going to drive the kind of cars we want to drive. And they can do just so much. Who was it I talked to coming in that was there at the big auto show last year in here somewhere? That took place just 2 weeks ago, I guess it was. This whole idea of autonomous vehicles, I was commenting to them since my background is in aviation, and people say, well, you can't, it's not believable that we can have autonomous vehicles out there. And I have to remind them that we are actually doing that now in the air. I mean, we've been doing that for a long period of time. That's not part of the subject here, but it's part of transportation. So yes, that was a lot of wishful thinking in that. And when the president says, yes, everything's on the table, and that would include the increase in the gas tax, he didn't say it in those words, but everything is on the table. And then the interpretation that this person had was, the president now wants to have a gas tax increase.
That's what I figured.
Yeah,
It was a little more general than what was being reported.
Well, Tom wants to say it this way.
So, a lot of the criticism, last time we had a big bundle of money that was supposed to go toward infrastructure, was the stimulus plan, more than $800 billion.
All right, let's go back there. That's very. I brought that up yesterday in the meeting. Can you folks remember 9 years ago, the first thing that President Obama, when he first became president, did? He said, "I've got to have $800 billion because we want to have transportation, we want to have stimulus, and to do it, we've got to bite the bullet and get the money in there." So he didn't get $800 billion; he got $836 billion. Now, what did he do with the 836? Does anyone here want to venture a guess as to how much of that $836 billion went to stimulus and went to transportation? 5%. 5%, that's all. So that was a very clever way that he was able to get all of that money in, and most of that went to his environmental agenda, and he was very smart the way he figured that out. Well, that's not going to be what you get now. Anything that comes in, and that also puts it in the realm. People say, well, you can't come up with that much money. Well, we did 9 years ago. Will you do it again? And this time we do it right. And this time I can assure you, look all of you in the eyes and say, it's going to go into transportation. It's going to go into infrastructure.
Part of the issue too with the stimulus, the problems with the so-called shovel-ready jobs, and that there weren't any. And there were delays in getting the work done. And so I think, people have a lot of interest in the president's infrastructure provisions that deal with reforming the permitting process. Some Democrats are worried about that. They're worried about,
Okay,
what do you think of those changes and how can that impact?
That's a fair observation because, the NEPA requirements and all of these things that are out there, and the environmental requirements that we're operating under. But let's keep in mind, we demonstrated very clearly with Barbara Boxer and me that we could still do these things. The streamlining that we did, right now, with the new legislation, however we get into this, the streamlining that we started, all of that's still intact. That's going to continue. And that's something that, what didn't come up yesterday, but has in meetings we've had with the White House before, we set the stage for that. Different thing. I remember they had I think it was 1% and you had to do that. Well, one of the things on my side that I wanted to get done, I said, that's fine, 1% for art. But let's change that, modify that a little bit and say 1% is going to go out there. And if they want to use it for art, that's fine. But if they want to use it for unfunded mandates, they can use it for that. And so that is now a part of the law, and that has been successful. On the streamlining, it doesn't mean, when he talks about knocking the 10 years down to 2 years, sure, that can be done. This is government. Anything that can be done in 10 years can be done in 2 years. If they just go ahead and do it. But it's the nature of the bureaucracy to try to make things last longer, because that way they can hire more people and they can grow. So it's those things that we have done, allowing us to not take shortcuts on the environment, but you doing the same thing but getting it done faster, setting goals out, and that's going to make a big difference. Each 3%, we've actually measured this in terms of knocking that 10 years down to 2 years, and how much more money you're going to have to be able to spend on getting the roads, highways, and infrastructure actually built by using these the shortcuts that they agreed with. And keep in mind that if you look at the Environment Public Works Committee, now I'm not chairman, I was already chairman for the maximum time you can be chairman, so now I'm chairman of the subcommittee of transportation, doing essentially the same thing. But also on the Commerce Committee, the jurisdiction of what we're talking about is divided equally between two committees, the Environment Public Works and the Commerce Committee. And so we're still involved in that from both committees. But on the Environment Public Works Committee, during the years that I was chairman, we had the very most liberal Democrats on that committee and the very most extreme conservative Republicans on that committee. And we got together. They kind of looked at Barbara Boxer and me and said, anything the two of them agree on, we got to look at pretty carefully. And now the people I've talked to more than the Republicans on the committee are Senator Whitehouse, Senator Cory Booker, Markey, the far extreme left. And we sit on the floor of the Senate and actually talk about what we want to get done in this in the legislation. So it's one of the do things that we can bring everyone together on. And we demonstrated we can do it. Again, that was part of the discussion. And I reminded them yesterday that we had, that we've been able to do things that other people on transportation issues didn't possess.
Well, it's good you passed a lot of bills together.
Well, yeah, not just the fast action and the chemical bill and the water bill. I used to say they had, Mitch McConnell has a meeting at noon on every Wednesday. And we get together and they call him the chairman of the committee. He says, gets around the meeting. I say, now from the committee that actually gets things done. We do.
So Democrats are worried though that there are various provisions in the infrastructure plan that could hurt safeguards like the Buy America Act, which is sort of this obscure 1933 law. How is that something that concerns you about making sure that the materials come from the United States? They're citing that as one of their major concerns with the infrastructure proposal.
It's interesting that they cite that as a major thing when that never came mentioned. And I think people are getting beyond that and saying, well, what's the most bang we can get for the buck? And so it sounds good on the stump, but we've got building to do.
What about the part of the infrastructure plan that addresses broadband? This is something totally new to the whole infrastructure process because we normally are talking about roads and bridges and things and not, broadband. There's $50 billion in infrastructure grants available with fewer limitations for rural areas, which has some people worried, well, instead of repairing a crumbling bridge, they're going to put in more broadband. There aren't safeguards in place to make sure the money's being spent on priorities. What do you think about that infrastructure? I mean, the broadband part of this debate and how it impacts these rural areas that really are.
Well, I'm from a rural state, Oklahoma, and when this is an area I know everyone in this room knows more about this than I do. In fact, when I get a new instrument for one of my airplanes, I have one of my grandkids read the instruction and explain it to me. So that's kind of where we are on that. But I do know that there's a great concern over broadband availability in rural areas. Now, I don't think we're married to a particular amount. I want to get it done. We don't really know right now. It's kind of like when he talks about breaking down his $200 billion. He has the $100 billion of that going to incentives, which is, he has 50 of that going to rural areas. Well, part of that 50 would actually be in broadband in rural areas. So we can't really be as specific as we would like to be as to how much is going to go to each area.
Mm-hmm. Another part of Trump's wishes on infrastructure has to do with aviation. And I know this is probably something of great interest to you. He's been a long time proponent now of privatizing the air traffic control.
It's not going to happen.
You don't support it, you don't think about it.
I know what we have. You all know this issue? Privatizing air traffic control. Yeah. It's something that is the brainchild of a good friend of mine over who's retiring from the House, Bill Schuster. And that's one thing he would like to get done, the feather he wants in his cap, and it's to privatize air traffic control. Well, I've been flying with the air traffic controllers now for over 60 years. And it's one of these things that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's working very well right now. And the privatizing is a good idea, but it's not going to work in areas where you have an asset that has to belong to everyone in this room. It has to belong to the public. And I'm talking about airspace. And I remember the meeting in the White House the very first week they came in. And that's one of the things that the president wanted to do. Privatizing sounds good. Everyone's for privatizing and all that. In some areas it won't work. In this area it won't work. And they tried to get it done. They can't even get the votes to get that out of the House. And the whole House was supposedly on board with this thing. They as of today, they like 15 votes getting out of the House. And then when we did the reauthorization of the FAA in the Commerce Committee, the chairman of that, Jonathan, we just discussed it briefly, and we didn't even vote on it because there weren't any votes in there to pass it. So it's another wishful thinking things isn't going to happen.
Well, what do you make of the delays in modernizing the air traffic control system? Because certainly there's some.
See, I don't buy that. In fact, they use this $39 billion a year. I want to see what they're talking about, because I don't know what they're talking about. But I do know air traffic control, and I have worked with those guys. I've flown, when you fly a lifetime, and you fly on instruments, and you fly with your life in somebody's hands, with a bureaucrat on the ground, that's, at first it's frightening, but it's a different group of people. And they're used to that, is that human element that we don't want to lose. Now, if you do privatize, they're going to have a committee. The committee's going to be, they'll have organized labor, they have the airlines, they have everybody on this committee, but it's not going to be one where we have any authority from the people who are making the decisions out there, and that's us in the House and the Senate. So that's what I say. I didn't mean to dwell on that, but it's not going to happen.
But do you see any need to make reforms to speed up
we are.
modernization? And what are some of those, what's happening with trying to get them onto the new system, new modern system of tracking airplanes instead of those little paper tickets that they're, the advocates of privatization, they like to hold up the paper tickets and say, this is what's happening in the air, in the old town.
It sounds good. I had an occasion to fly an airplane around the world a short while ago. I was emulating the flight of Wiley Post. We have two heroes, Will Rogers and Wiley Post. And Wiley Post is the one I pilot. And so I was tracking his. So I was in all these countries, just with their air traffic controllers. I've been there, I've dealt with them, and that no one can touch the way that we're doing it here. Now they talk about this marvelous Canadian system, and that's what you're thinking about right now, because you've been listening to these guys. Listen to me.
I have no choice, I have to listen.
Yes, no, I don't.
So you're saying that no need to really get going on modernization, no need for extra money?
Oh, no, it's modernized. We modernize
Okay.
all the time. We have systems, and I wish they were longer. I'll tell you the story that happened down on the Mexican border with me, that our system is working very well.
What do you think of the entry into the whole drones and the need to regulate drones? And how do you feel Congress has exerted its authority on that? And does there need to be more or less control of people who use drones?
I think it's about right now. And it's the drones are one thing you can't lose sight of, and that is everybody's got drones. I mean, the enemy's they have drones. We saw what happened last weekend. Drone knocked down an F-16, I guess it was. And so they're out there, and they're for real. And so we want to stay ahead of the crowd on that. We want to be able to use them. We can use them in combat. We can use them, and every time they come up with something that doesn't work as well. To give you an example, on pipelines, how much easier it is to fly pipelines with drones than it would be with manned aircraft. And so I put an amendment on there that is now so that we can outline a number of places where they can use drones beyond the limits that are legally acceptable right now. So that's a changing thing every day. Drones are here, drones are real, and we're going to stay ahead of the pack.
A lot of private citizens have drones. They just use them recreationally, and I know that commercially there's talk of having your pizza delivered by a drone, your Amazon order.
Well, I keep hearing things like that. That'll probably happen.
And should there be regulations though, and
Well, there are
safety that they're not,
Yeah, the committee that is in charge of those regulations is the Congress Committee. We have, right now, we have a subcommittee working just on that. We've had, I think, 4 hearings already this past year on the regulation hearings. And that's a work in progress. It's new enough. It's kind of like the broadband.
Right.
If you get into something that's new, it's going to be a work in progress for a long time.
Quickly back to infrastructure. Just now that we're on the topic of the money, the big problem with infrastructure has always been the highway trust fund, and it's underfunded. There have been various proposals to try to keep it permanently funded. None have gained enough traction. Is there anything you support that would keep funding at the right level in the highway trust funds? We're not always talking about
should have indexed it at that time. But we didn't see a need to index it because there wasn't a problem at that time. We were forward looking at it. It never occurred to me. But I think we should do that. And I think a lot of people who have not been supporters of increasing a tax, that particular tax, are supportive of indexing it.
So now we're getting into the part where the president has given us his infrastructure plan, and what happens next? People want to know, is there going to be legislation? What happens with your committee? Could you lay out the process for how Congress will try to take on this infrastructure?
Okay, we were talking about that yesterday morning in the White House, and one of the things, when you're having a meeting, the press is not there, sometimes there's an assumed confidentiality, but never about what you personally said. So my appeal to them was, we've got something that works. We've demonstrated, well, nothing else was working. Our infrastructure is working, not just MAP 21 and the FAST Act, but it's been working for a long period of time. Because when we opened up this conversation, we talked about transportation is different from all other expenditures of government because it's popular. Everybody wants it, and that's why it's different, and why we're going to be able to successfully get it done. But my appeal yesterday was, let's don't be looking for new ways to do things we already know how to do. Because we did, and some people I recognize in this room were there bleeding with us during the FAST Act and some of the other defense authorizations. And we now have some good things. I mentioned some of the Republicans that are trying to get their conservative credentials from the transportation bills. They're not doing that anymore because they realize that that's not popular.
Do you think that the Senate can produce legislation this year? Will you wait for the House? How will this work?
Okay, what I think is going to happen, and I mentioned that, and there are nods of approval from the president that, yeah, we know this is one of the things that has worked before. You've been able to do it. You've been able to make adjustments to streamline things that you wouldn't be able to make otherwise because it's necessary in order to get the stuff done to have transportation working. We use the same argument on the water bill too, which is a part of this. So I would say that we are going to go ahead, and we are doing it now. We're putting together the framework, and that's what the conversation was about yesterday morning. Because we had all of the chairmen of all the committees in one room with the president and talking about what we're going to do. Now, it's natural, I think, for the president to want to take a leadership role. He's entitled to do that. He's a president who will be running again for re-election, and this is going to be a popular thing. And for that reason, I think it's going to move pretty fast. I've already said that that's his style anyway. You start on one thing and you see it through and get it done, and then you start on something else. Well, we're through with taxation now. We're going to do it with transportation. So we will draft legislation in the House and the Senate. And if you remember last time, it was not the House as much as the Senate. We had the Senate bill, and then we went over to the House, and it was fairly easy to pass in the House. And I can remember on MAP 21, we had all of these conservative Republicans opposing it on the floor. And I can say things others can't say because I've always been in it. Anytime they mention the three most conservative members, I'm always among the three. So with that, I can talk about, I can criticize some of my friends who are using that to establish conservative credentials, which is exactly what we're trying to do in MAP 21. So we passed the House, the Senate, and I went over to the House and I met at my request with all the Republicans and the House committee. That's MAP 21. And all of them, just during that meeting, that was the day after we passed it in the Senate, and they all agreed to support it in the House. So I'm saying that because we're established there in that leadership position, and we will do it again at the same time, this time working with the White House. And in fact, a lot of the guys at the White House now are people I've known since the Reagan days, and so we know each other. So I think it's going to be done. It's going to be overseen by the White House, and I think that's what it should be.
Have you been working, another way to come up with this $200 billion, or will it have to become deficit spending?
well, if we could come up with $836 billion for Barack Obama and ended up not spending it what he said he was going to spend, that $200 billion is not going to present a problem.
I'll get off topic just for a little bit. Today there's going to be a big immigration debate and vote in the House. I see you put a few amendments out last night. What do you think the state of play is of what's going to pass in your mind out of this group of amendments that are coming to the floor today? And maybe tell us a little bit about the amendments that you put forward.
Well, today is, tomorrow a recess starts. One thing, so if you're looking for something to happen today, as they have designed to have it happen, then you're wasting a lot of time, and it's not going to happen today. There will be some amendments. I will say this about our leader, Mr. McConnell. He's been very honest, straightforward. He's been saying for 2 weeks now to Democrats, get your amendments, put them on, all of them will get a hearing. No, I'm not going to reject anybody. Just do it. What's happened? Nothing. They haven't put anything out until last night. And so I think that will happen if we get back in the recess. We'll continue the debate and we'll get done. Now, keep in mind, we're on deadlines right now. But I can't imagine anything. Well, again, I'm out of my school here. I don't know. Right now, I'm sure that Schumer and Mitch are talking, and I'm here, so I don't know this answer.
Are there any of the proposals something you can get behind?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think when he came out and he was talking about the path to citizenship, I didn't agree with that, and the reason, and I've been very straightforward about this, I've been really blessed in having the opportunity to be the speaker at naturalization ceremonies for a long period of time. If you look out there and you see these people they've learned their history, they've learned your language, and we've moved on pretty good.
What about concerns by environmentalists to make sure that there are provisions in this bill that address, the green energy and fossil fuel concerns? I know you've taken a pretty hard line stance on this, and I'm sure you're probably ready for that coming from the Democratic side. What do you anticipate?
Well, first of all, just to clarify that, because I have said, and I've got speeches I've made on the floor about the climate changes. It's always changed. All evidence is there. I mean, natural evidence, scriptural evidence, it's always changing, and it's always going to be changing. Well, we anticipate that's the case, but to make a religion out of it, and to have that governing everything that you do, and the costs going up to try to satisfy some ideals that have nothing to do in this case with transportation, I don't think it's a good idea. Money's going to be too hard to come by. But I'm not worried about it, because if Barbara Boxer, every one of these things, she agreed. And with her leadership at that time, we were able to go. And I mentioned today, as we speak, I mentioned the 3 most liberal members. They're very good friends of mine. We sit on the floor and we talk about this. They're all exercised. They are not that concerned. I guess you'd be better off getting that from them than getting it from me. But we did the things that were logically wise to do and made an exception, because this is transportation we're talking about, and there wasn't a dissenting vote among them from me.
What do you think the hardest challenge will be then for working with Democrats to get a bill like this done?
Well, I think one thing you want to stay on course, if you're talking about several different things. If you're talking about just roads and highways, and bridges, that's going to be fairly easy, because we know the obstacles that are out there, but we've overcome those obstacles recently. And so there's now a precedent that is set. I mean, get in some of the other areas on inland waterways and those. That's new territory. That wasn't covered in the legislation where we were successful. So, but, we do it. If it's all wrapped up in one package, they want the package. And I'm talking about the ones who are totally different philosophy.
Well, they're questioning right now the $200 billion that the president is putting forward is going to involve cuts elsewhere to